Hey there everyone, it's Alex here from VG247.com, and I've been playing for a little bit now, Octopath Traveler. I'm many tens of hours into it now, and although we don't do scored reviews on VG247, as regular readers of the site and visitors to the channel will know, I wanted to do a little sort of verbal review for you of what I think of this game. Before we start, it's well worth saying that the footage I'm going to be using here is from Chapter 1 and some Chapter 2s. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but two, Nintendo has some restrictions on what we can and can't show, and so it's just easier for me to load up a save that's 10, 15, 20 hours in than to go for my 40-hour save and have to be cutting around loads of story spoiler stuff and loads of stuff Nintendo don't want you to see, like for instance what some of the costumes are for some of the advanced classes later in the game. So, a little bit of background up top. If you don't know what Octopath Traveler is, it's a Japanese RPG, very traditionally styled, coming from Square Enix, but Nintendo are the guys who are actually picking up the tab for publishing it in the West and getting it localized and all that sort of stuff. Very similar to what happened with the Bravely Default games on the 3DS. So yeah, that's basically what it is, and I think it's a pretty great throwback to that era of Japanese RPGs. We are talking very typical turn-based combat, so not even active time battle like in the later Final Fantasy games from the Super Nintendo onwards, but actually full-on turn-based combat, and in that sense it actually resembles Final Fantasy X a bit, and many other games, but I think Final Fantasy X is the most obvious touchstone, where you've got the order of which people are going to take actions listed at the top of the screen at all times during battle, and so you're planning ahead to sort of make things happen in a certain order to make the most of any given situation as you're fighting. The battle system I really enjoy. It's basically mostly centers around strengths and weaknesses and a break system where any enemy, if you hit it with a weakness a certain number of times, you will break that enemy and therefore stop them from acting, essentially stun them, paralyze them for a certain number of turns, which then in turn will let you actually get stuck in and deal more damage to them while they're vulnerable. And then you're having to think very carefully about when you're going to stun them in relation to where you're at in your turn, how soon they're going to act, what actions you're going to be interrupting, and that in turn encourages you to buff and stuff like that too. It's a really good combat system, and that's layered atop a game that I think is really beautiful in terms of presentation and style. I've got some slight issues with the developers call it HD 2D, the aesthetic they've gone for, and I have some issues with when you're walking around the overworld. I think it can be a little bit confusing as to which parts of the area you can walk into and which parts are blocked off by the terrain or by invisible walls. They've got an option in the game to sort of turn off dark outlines around stuff, which you would think would help, but doesn't help nearly as much as you might hope with that problem. But that's really the only thing that stands out in terms of aesthetically that's a problem with the game. The music is fantastic, the sprites are gorgeous, the larger-than-life boss sprites are amazing, and I want to say, when it comes to combat, the boss fights, which really do not pull any punches and really are quite challenging and difficult, are really the highlight of the game in terms of the sprites, visual design of the sprites of the guys and characters you're fighting, but also just how challenging and exciting those boss battles are to tackle. In an age when a lot of Japanese RPGs do feel like they play it safe and for lack of a better word, dumb it down a little bit, Octopath Traveler definitely does not do that. But it's not a game without flaws, and weirdly, for a game where the developers talked a bit about considering it a sort of spiritual successor to Final Fantasy VI, at least in part, it's got some serious story problems. So Octopath Traveler comes from the fact that there are 8 characters and therefore 8 paths that you can walk throughout the game. So, you know, that means that each of these 8 characters has a unique backstory, has their own stuff going on, and you've got to figure out which one you're going to pick. It's completely open-ended, so you don't have a main character. There's no Terra or Cloud or Bart's figure in this, to use Final Fantasy based examples. You get to pick any one of the 8 cast, and then when you experience their introduction story, which is their chapter 1 story, you're then let loose into the world, and from there you have options. You could go and pursue that character's chapter 2 story, but that will be a much higher level, or you can go and find another character's chapter 1 complete that chapter 1, and then recruit them to your growing party. It's 4 characters at any given time in your party while you're rolling around, but if you want, you absolutely can swap out and pick up more than 4 characters. And in fact, if you want, you can pick up all 8 before tackling any chapter 2s. The whole game is open-ended, and that's a really, really cool aspect of it. The downside is that it feels like the developers perhaps couldn't marry that open-ended nature with traditional RPG storytelling. And there's nothing wrong with being non-traditional, but the problem that Octopath Traveler has is that it's focused on these 8 individual stories, almost like Canterbury Tales or Aesop's Fables style stories, where they're all relatively disconnected. Every character has their own goal, and they're all, I said relatively, not just relatively disconnected, but in a weird sense completely disconnected, in that when you are playing as one character on one of their missions, so let's say you go to one particular character's chapter 2, only that character is really going to talk and interact with characters in that story thread, in that chapter 2. If you go to another character's chapter 1, only they're going to talk. The other party members will be there for battles and stuff, at least usually, but everyone's silent. They haven't gone to the extent of writing script for things that for things that other characters might say in any given situation. Unlike, say, how, again, to use the Final Fantasy comparison, a Final Fantasy game will have different things that different people will say depending on who you take to any given set of story beats. This isn't really a game about a main plot. It's just about these individual little stories, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, because it just feels... The narrative feels a bit dead as a result, and it's really unfortunate. Like, some of these little stories are really engaging and really nice and really fun, but the problem is, because none of the rest of the party react to it, it can feel like a party of 8 characters journeying around together, even though they don't know each other and don't care about each other. And though the game does offer some things, so once you start doing chapter 2s, for instance, you'll start encountering little skits that are reminiscent of the one-on-one character interactions you sometimes get in Fire Emblem or Tales of. But they are just little skits. Nothing of any worth really comes from them. And while there is some story crossover once you get deeper and deeper into the game, it really comes so late that at that point I feel like if you're coming in for the story, you're either going to have fallen in love with the individual stories, or you're going to have turned around and walked away from this game already, because we are talking this stuff arriving, you know, potentially 10 hours in, potentially 15 hours in. And that's the case for a lot of stuff here. There are secondary job classes that you can pick up and then equip to characters, but again, those aren't really signposts to you, so you can encounter those within the first 5 hours, or you could not encounter them for 20. And this stuff feels a little bit problematic in the same way the story stuff feels problematic, where sometimes the freedom the game gives you can instead just make it feel a little bit directionless, and at its absolute worst, a little bit soulless, which is so weird for a game that has so much soul in its beautiful music and in really lovely character designs and in an absolutely gorgeous visual aesthetic. And it's a big problem, and it's something that I struggled with a lot while playing the game. But then everything else about it is so good. I mean, if nothing else, we can say this feels like a great foundation on which to build perhaps a series of games with this art style, with this sense of visual flair, but perhaps with better executed story next time around. But even so, I think Octopath Traveler is well worth a look, so long as you understand the caveat of how these stories are really, really disconnected, and how the game really just throws you out there. And one other caveat, which is this is a very, very grindy game, and because of the nature of the story, if you complete, say, Primrose's chapter 1 and then really want to go straight to her chapter 2, you only have 2 choices. You can either spend a long time grinding, or you can go and do other things first. And so even though it's an open-ended game, if the jump between a chapter 1 and a chapter 2 is chapter 1 is level 10, 11, or even lower, and chapter 2 is level 23, 24, 25, then obviously you can't marry those 2 together and just go from one to the other unless you're breaking the battle system in some interesting ways. And again, that feeds into the weirdness around the story, where if you're particularly invested in one character's story, you might begrudge going off and doing another character's story, considering that you're not going to really get anything out of any other characters other than the one who that story is about during that character story. It's strange. And to be honest with you, it feels a little bit like maybe they probably would have intertwined these stories more, and maybe they just ran out of time and ran out of money. But what's there is really, really good, really, really beautiful, really fun, engaging battle system, if a little grindy. And if you're looking for a Japanese RPG on Switch, I think you'd struggle to go wrong with this one. So yeah, that's Octopath Traveler. It's not perfect, and I think it's going to be a divisive game. I think you're going to find with press reviews and with public impressions that people are either going to love it or hate it, depending on their relationship to the grinding and the way the story is presented. But if you're a fan of Japanese RPGs, you should definitely at least give it a go. There's a great demo out there right now, and by the time this video is up, the game will pretty much almost be out, so you won't have long to wait. So yeah, I think it's a good get for Nintendo, and I really hope that this continues to become perhaps a series, or if Octopath itself doesn't become a series, that these developers can go and take the technology and the know-how they've built up with this game and build something even better next time around. So yeah, that's Octopath Traveler. Until next time, everyone, see ya.